This is the Wait Just an Infosec podcast, your weekly opportunity to tap into the minds of some of the world's foremost cybersecurity experts. Wait Just an Infosec is a weekly show live streamed on SANS Institute social media channels on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. The show features a wide range of guests from across the Infosec community. Whether we're diving into the weeds of the latest data breach or exploring the security implications of groundbreaking technology such as generative AI, each episode brings you new insight to keep you engaged in the industry, feed your fire for knowledge, and amplify your value as an Infosec practitioner. Join the SANS community and gain free access to cutting-edge industry news, cybersecurity resources like technical research, and tools that can't be found elsewhere. Subscribe for free today at sans.org/join.
This episode of Wait Just an Infosec is all about open source intelligence, how we use it in our everyday lives, and how it's used by cybersecurity professionals. The segment you're about to hear features guest host Rob Lee and the Dark Knight of OSINT himself, Matt Edmondson. Matt is a SANS Principal Instructor and author of the course SEC 497, Practical Open Source Intelligence.
Matt, where are you? Let's chat. Hey,
I'm here. First things first, Rob, do you have any idea how many messages I've got over the past couple of days congratulating me on the new Dark Knight title, saying that they've switched my names and the contacts? So I owe you, buddy. I owe you.
Well, I do think it's appropriate. I'm kind of a comic book nerd with the stuff behind me. And before we get into it, I'm a little bit fascinated with all that stuff that's behind you. You're obviously a baseball fan. So, point out, just a couple of those items behind you so the audience knows.
That's what a Ty Cobb signed check, a few other baseballs and stuff over there. And then the most important stuff, you always got to have bourbon within arm's reach. So that way, if things start going really, really bad, it's just that it actually get up from the chair.
That's amazing. What is the cube?
What is the cube? It's actually a light. It's off right now because it looks kind of funky, but it's just like this light. It's carved into it's a solid piece of a stone. But then it's got like a little light inside. It's really cool. And of course, I'm a nerd too. It always reminds me of a Borg cube.
Yeah, I was going to say the Borg cube that's in, to assimilate everything. All right. So open source intelligence. We're going to go ahead and pull up the poll and see where everyone's landing on this. And kind of curious, like before we dive into this with you, is like OSINT is, kind of across the board. The word cloud here. And again, you still have a chance to throw your stuff into the word cloud. But, Matt, when you're looking at this, is this surprising to you when you're initially talking about OSINT, when you're trying to describe it to people?
No, not at all. It's kind of funny, too. One of my favorite things is when people show up for class and it's like, oh, no, I've never done any OSINT before. Like, BS, how did you find out about the class, right? We all do OSINT every day in our lives, but so many more businesses now are realizing that they need it. And I'm fascinated constantly with people telling me what they're doing OSINT. A friend of mine who's kind of very big in the OSINT industry, a huge part of her job right now, and she's self-employed, is basically researching property. And I'm like, what? And she's actually providing consulting on people who want to buy property. And it's like, oh, I want to buy some property outside of this city. She'll look, see who else is buying property around there and be like, oh, hey, well, these people bought this land over here. And 3 times when they've done that in the past in other cities, they've ended up like turning it into a beautiful area, putting in a Whole Foods, doing all this stuff. So you should buy around there. And it's mind boggling of like the different ways that people are doing OSINT. It's all over the place.
Yeah. Looking at this data leak, easy access for cyber criminals. And, that's something that's interesting, which I'd like to get into is like, those with great power have great responsibility, as the saying goes. But the idea that this information that's available online is available to anyone. So it can be used for both good and evil. Comment on that. I'm interested.
No, absolutely. It's a lot of times I kind of describe it as the seedy underbelly of the internet, because there's a lot more information, frankly, on the internet than there is in the dark web. And sometimes you have to go to the dark web, and that can be annoying and has its own special set of challenges. But so many times, like, I hang out in those areas just to see what's going on. It's important to be aware of it because, things happen and information gets leaked out. I think back to, what was it, about 2 years ago now, the Qualys breach. And Qualys didn't do anything wrong. There was a vulnerability in something else. But all of a sudden now, organizations were hearing there was rumors of, hey, there was vulnerability scans of Qualys clients sitting there on the dark web, right? And reaching out to me like, hey, do you have a copy of this? Can you get a copy of this? We want to see what our exposure is, right? And so trying to go and deal with some of these different things just to analyze and see once the data is out there, it really helps you to understand what's out there so you know to protect against it. Another one I remember during COVID in 2020, there was something called Blue Leaks. Some of you may remember it was 262 gigabytes of law enforcement information that was leaked out. A lot of people's personal contact information, their work contact information, and once again, just trying to gobble all of that and deal with that large data set to let agencies and individuals know what their exposure was. And so absolutely, breach data is a tricky thing because I understand some people, it's immoral to kind of look at or try to collect, but I kind of always had the viewpoint of it's out there. The criminals are using it. Like I at least want to know what's out there so we can know what we need to protect against.
So, I mean, this is the hard part about OSINT is like it's all over the place, but, you know, how do you define it in a more of a box for, you know, why would an organization want to invest into a skill set that includes OSINT? And is it a separate career or is it a skill set that everyone should have? You know, those two things. I'm kind of curious.
Yes, no, it's absolutely a skill set that everyone should have. I mean, it really is like just the different things that I do over the course of a month, right? Financial and merger and acquisition due diligence, you know, kind of analyzing infrastructure, certain things like that. And things are, I talk about it in the class a little bit, and I've talked about it before when I've spoke, things are all kind of blended together now. I see law enforcement people that don't consider themselves technical that are all of a sudden researching IP addresses, trying to figure out, is this a VPN? Is this, or is this actually where the person lives? And then I've seen people, I remember there was some Twitter code that I wrote for persistent monitoring to alert me if anything met criteria. And I wrote that for my personal use. And I wrote that for when I was still with the government to try to keep an eye on certain things. But then during 2020 here in the US, when we had civil unrest, I know of multiple Fortune 500 companies that were running that code. And I didn't find out about it till after the fact, trying to monitor like, hey, is it safe for our people to go into this building? Or we've had people in this building for 14 hours now, but they don't feel like it's safe to leave. And so you see people, it's all kind of blending together, right? And everyone is just kind of doing, there's really no, oh, well, I'm doing OSINT, I'm in this. But there's still a lot of that. But once again, everyone's. So I think it's very, very important to be well-rounded. And there's really no one that can't benefit from having OSINT as one of their skill sets because it sounds so dumb, but there's so much information out there. You know, I just retired from the government last year, but I was an agent for almost 22 years. And you think like, oh, the government knows everything. No, it's a lot of times it feels like we know almost nothing, right? There's so much more information on the internet, and it behooves you to get very, very good at searching that, finding that, and dealing with what you find.
Well, let's talk about that real quick. You just mentioned you retired from the government, and I'm not sure how much you're able to dive into that, you know, specifically what you did, but how did you get here? How are you the Dark Knight of OSINT? And I know I gave you that moniker. That's what happens. I have my own that someone else gave me, but we're not going to talk about that one. So you're in open source intelligence. You have this background, you have this experience, and now you're teaching this class on it. You know, why you? How do you have this background in deep technical skill? How did you get here?
It's kind of crazy. I grew up very, very poor, and so I didn't really go to college. I went to 2 years of community college because in California, if you're an orphan, they'll basically pay you to go to community college. But then I started working for the government very, very young because it was a stable career, but I wasn't technical at all. You know, I wasn't afraid of it and I was good with it, but I didn't have like that strong background. But I would see things around the office that needed to be done. And back then it was really cool. We had these things called bookstores, and I would go down to the bookstore and buy a book on like databases or something else and read it and then come back into work and just do what needed to be done. And it wasn't my job. It was just, if I don't do it, we're not going to have this capability. And after doing that for a few months, it just kind of the word kind of spreads. You start helping people around and doing some kind of cool things, I think. And I got a phone call one day and they said, hey, do you want to come up here and be an intelligence agent and just kind of focus on some of this more technical work? And I'm like, yeah. So I was doing a lot of stats, maps, analysis, certain things like that. But I developed a very, very strong interest in digital forensics. And at that time, they said, hey, we're not going to pay you for any training. You have to pay for everything out of pocket. And I started researching, and that's when I first found out about SANS. So I started taking different courses, teaching myself, got to the point where I felt very comfortable with forensics. I've done forensics on over 1,000 devices, testified in court numerous times, all that type of stuff. And then I started to get an interest in kind of incident response, right? Kind of like the next level of forensics. But it was just the way my mind worked of teaching myself and going to these different classes and not wanting to skip over intermediate steps. I felt like I needed to learn how to hack before I learned for evidence of people hacking. And so that's when I did the same thing. I started taking, once again, the SANS courses on pen testing, right? Going to Black Hat, taking courses on exploit development, grabbing my OSCP, and getting to the point where I was very, very well rounded. And as I started doing more offensive style work, you just the biggest step is reconnaissance, right? It's gathering up all of this information. That's what drives everything else you're doing. And it sounds so kind of obvious in hindsight, but as I was doing more and more of this automation to gather information, I'm like, God, there's so much of this that could apply, that could help out in my day job, right? And the different analysts and the agents that I work with every single day. And so I wrote a white paper calling for the formation of, listen, we should probably develop an OSINT cell and probably develop a team doing this style of work. And I shot it up the chain of command, and I never thought I would hear anything back. And then like a week later, they said, yeah, nope, we read this. We agree. We think it's a great idea. And we're pulling you out of forensics to do it. So it wasn't even necessarily my intent to kind of run it, but that's where I ended up. And then things just kind of exploited from there. So it was a weird, long roundabout way to get there, but I'm glad where I ended up.
Yeah, this is completely amazing, because a lot of times, a lot of people find themselves in a career field that, that was not their plan,
OSINT is very rewarding for whatever you bring in it. It really, really, truly is. I remember, it's so funny, the first time I taught the new OSINT class that we wrote, my TA was laughing one afternoon. And the reason is, they said that they got a comment from someone and they said, it is clear that, Matt had pen testers in mind when he wrote this class. And literally within an hour later, they got another comment from someone said, man, it's clear that Matt had forensics professionals in mind when he wrote this class. And it was laughing. It's like, I didn't even have either in mind. It's just all this stuff. And I'm telling how it's helped me in my career in these problems. The entire class is all problems that I've run into in the private sector, in the public sector, whatever it is, and how we kind of solved them.
So we're going to go ahead and throw up our second poll, because what you're just talking about there is directly tied to this, which is, you just mentioned penetration testing, offensive operations, and cyber investigations. So, this is again for the audience, in a few words, write out the type of engagements you use OSINT for currently. And it could be pen testing, could be, you name it, the types of things you might be using. I was kind of curious where this stands, but, Matt, in the meantime, while they're filling that out, I have a question for you, and I'm wondering if you could, if there's one thing you could say, everyone should go try this after this session, just as an example of something, how easy and how powerful it is. And I'm trying to prep you and give you enough time to think about this. You know where I'm going with this. Is there something you'd say, go try this right now, hit this website. This is a massive resource. What is one thing that you could go tell everyone if they want to get their feet wet immediately after this to go play with? What would that be?
I think it sounds so basic, right? Years ago, I had a Brazilian jiu-jitsu instructor that told me that the advanced stuff is usually just the basics done very well and at the right time. And it sounds so basic, but just getting good and efficient with Google searches, and then something as simple as Google Alerts. If you just think of how powerful Google Alerts is, when I was developing the Sec 497 course for months, I couldn't really talk about it publicly. And so I would actually set up Google Alerts for keywords about that class. And just, hey, if you see any mention of this on the internet, fire me an email, because I want to know. No one should be talking about this. And so people think of, sensitive information going out there, and how are you even supposed to know about that? Just thinking of key alerts, like, hey, what's certain, I've done it before, even for like executives, for once again, public and private sector, but combinations of like their names, the street that they live on, maybe their phone number, and setting up these alerts. So if that information ends up on the internet, that you hear about it first, right? And that was one of the things that I was tasked with in the government, right? When you get these key kind of figures in the public eye that start getting protests at their house, right? And I was the one who was tasked with basically, hey, if there's going to be a protest at this person's house, they want to hear about it from us, not when their wife's calling, letting them know that there's a protest at their house. And so just some of these alerts, these almost, for lack of a better term, tripwires that we can set up to where when people start talking about these sensitive information, we get a hit. And so something, like I said, as simple as setting up a few Google alerts to see if your sensitive information is out there is so quick and simple and free.
Well, it's also, it's also from a corporate perspective, brand, in addition to, social engineering stuff, a lot of people forget this. A lot of corporations forget about, how crucial their brand is. And from a legal side, having OSINT be scanning to see if anyone is using your brand or selling your product illegally or potentially representing your brand on a different website, that kind of stuff, I've seen a lot of corporations really invest heavily, and they don't even consider it cybersecurity. They consider part of legal enforcement of IP. Do you have, any comments on that, where you've been involved in any of those kind of cases?
More than I care to talk about. Absolutely more than I care to talk about to kind of run down. It's said in there too, kind of like analyzing public infrastructure. And once again, that's something that I've done quite a bit, the merger and acquisition due diligence, right? Large company getting ready to buy a smaller company. And the smaller company says, here's all the infrastructure that we have. It's never accurate. Right. And it's not that they're trying to hide stuff. It's just never accurate. Right. People don't have a good idea of what's out there. And then the sensitive information. Absolutely. Right. So many times it's when you're kind of doing a post-mortem, when someplace gets hacked and you're trying to go back and figure out what that initial infection point was. And there was one time last year when it was basically the most likely way that the attackers got in there, what this organization ended up believing was that someone on one of these jobs boards, it was basically an unintentional malicious insider, just giving out, talking about what they do on a day in, day out basis and giving away a very detailed description of their technical stack and unintentionally laying out a game plan for an attacker to come in and compromise them.
Yeah.
And so, it's one of those questions. It's actually a very good question that I love asking as technical people is, monitoring what people are saying about your organization. Obviously, that's important for public relations. Yeah. Obviously, that's important for HR, but this is important for technical people. And more now, I see the technical people going, absolutely, because in their lives and their careers, they've run into instances when that actually was key, right? Because you're the one who has to deal with it.
There's I'm going to pitch a webcast that I think you should do because I think it'd be very popular beyond just the cybersecurity community, but OSINT for dating. If you think about that for a second, it's like I was in a conversation. I was talking to a friend of mine who was talking about, trying to validate, people they're about to meet online, and then they get their phone number, and they went through this entire thing about, I look up their phone number, I do this background check, I'm going to meet this person out. And I said, you know what you're doing? And they said, no. I said, that's open source intelligence. And they're like, well, that sounds kind of, like, iffy, but I really feel I need to protect myself. But, even just doing a basic webcast on, hey, if you're going and meeting a person for the first time, online dating, anything, here's some things you could easily do to, help protect yourself. I think, the average individual out there would everyone should watch this, just in case, because this is something that is used for good, but it also be used, some people putting in the comments there for social engineering, for profiling, and so forth. But, anyways, I'm just going to drop that webcast. If in the comments, if people want that webcast, throw it in there saying we want a webcast on how to do proper background investigations on someone I'm about to meet from an online dating app. Because this is the kind of thing, this touches everyone, just like forensics. It's one of these things is when you start showing people, like even on your iPhone, like the frequent locations that iPhone's tracking, people's eyes just go pop. So let's talk about your course real quick. So it's a new course, even though SANS has been doing OSINT for a while. What is new about this course? What is exciting about it? What, someone comes into this course, what are some 3 key things they're going to walk away with when they walk out?
Yeah, even the name, just practical open source intelligence, right? Like I have, once again, over 20 years with the U.S. government, a lot of experience with the intelligence community, with law enforcement, also the private sector as well. But a lot of people don't realize this. You do. My wife, actually, she was one of the early employees at CrowdStrike, and she ran cyber threat intelligence for a Fortune 100. And so obviously kind of helping out with that, kind of all working together, it leaves me with a very, very well-rounded perspective in how different people across all public and private sectors are using OSINT and the problems that they run into. And that's what the class is. The class is just problems that we've run into, and this is how we solved them, right? It's so funny. I get the comments sometimes of the labs, the infrastructure that we've set up and go through it, and I try to make them to have a good time. And I get comments all the time like, "Oh my God, you're so creative." And it's like, no, I'm not. Like, this is all things that have happened to me, like for pretty much every lab in the class. Like we can sit there and I can tell you exactly what the story was behind that. It's just a real world problem, and this is how we've solved it. And so I think that's been the big focus, right? It's a focus on, this is what we're doing this week, but Monday next week, when you go back to work, like immediately you can start applying these things. And that's a big point of it, right? And it's just really taking the time to not just introduce people to concepts, but talking about how it's helped me out, like how this is applied to me to help them realize how they can use it as well too. And then to have all these hands-on labs that they can give them a chance to kind of see how they can have success with it. So
tell me about one of the more exciting labs that they do in the class.
One of the more exciting labs. Well, there was one. It's kind of funny. Once again, right? The advanced stuff, just the basics done very, very well. And there's something that I kind of jokingly refer to as big bounty, right? When someone reaches out to an organization and says, "Hey, I found a vulnerability, pay me." Right? They know if an organization doesn't have a bug bounty program, right, kind of set up to do that. And it's something that I kind of help out with a lot, because they always send anonymous email addresses. You can't kind of trace them down. You can't do anything like that. And this, once again, it's so simple, but I remember this was about a year ago, and reviewing one of these emails that came in that was trying to basically kind of blackmail this company to pay them a vulnerability. And they ended the email with a very kind of thinly veiled threat. And it was something along the lines of like, "Well, we'll see how this works out for you. Not my problem, but that's the way the cookie crumbles." But they didn't say the saying just like you would expect a normal person to say in English. It was slightly off. Like if I say, "Oh, that's the way the cookie crumbles," if I say, "That's the way the Oreo crumbles," we all know what I'm talking about. It's kind of the same sentiment, but it's not the way we would say it. And so we're looking at this email, and my wife's looking at this, and she's like, "This person's not a native English speaker." And I'm like, "What? No, not a native English speaker?" It's like, "Oh yeah, I guess you're right." And took that unique saying that they said, searched it on the internet, and got one hit. And the one hit was from a Twitter profile of someone who was a web security, like an independent web security researcher, bug bounty hunter based out of the Netherlands. Right. And so something just as stupid as identifying something unique and then searching for it and finding it tied to one person. Like I said, we cover like, a lot of technical stuff and researching IPv6 addresses to see if they're tied to wireless and all these technical things too. But that's just such a basic example, right, of just kind of a thought process and a methodology of going through to find out what was going on. So
it's very valid. One of my first investigations I was involved in when OSI, very similar. There was a hacker that used a drop site that was named, something really stupid, as a back end where they're secure copying all their files to. You looked up that domain, and of course the domain was registered is like, at 31337 Excel, Connecticut or something like that. But I got the IP address, and I did reverse on the IP address, and it ended up being a cable modem. And I think, eureka! After like the guy set up his drop site as his home. What? Oops! And based on that, we got subscriber information, and there was like all these ties, to the name of the site, to his hacker handle, and everything else. Within that information being provided, OSI agents and FBI agents were storming within 48 hours at 6 a.m.
Nice. One more story is another one's kind of incorporated in there. And this was during COVID, and getting a phone call. They were looking for an international fugitive, and they had subpoenaed from their email provider and had the last few IP addresses that they had checked their email address from. So I'm researching them and like kind of, and basically the place where they've been traveling over the past couple of weeks, and no one knew where this person was. And the most recent IP address came back to an island. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, no indication of a VPN, looking at Shodan, looking at Census, like no indication of VPN. I'm like, God, this actually seems like it's pretty legit. And then when I started to, once again, using like Census, Shodan to start looking at certificates associated with that IP space and just realizing like, wait a second, like okay, this IP address is tied to a hotel chain, right? It was a European-based hotel chain. And I looked up, and that hotel chain did have a hotel on the island. And so many times over my career, I felt like I was Captain Buzzkill. Just people would get excited. We found the criminal. They're in Germany. It's like, no, they're not using VPN. No, they're not. They're doing this. And with this, I told them, like, I think they're right there. And they went back to the country, and they came back, and they're like, no, the country says they never came into the country. And I'm like wincing as I say it. I'm like, I stand by what I said. And about 2 days later, that was on a Thursday, I think. And then it was that Saturday or Sunday, that weekend, I got a phone call and said, hey, we just want to let you know we caught the fugitive. I'm like, beautiful. Where were they? They're like, exactly where you said they were. It's like, it was like Billy Madison when he run the second grade spelling bee, like, I'm the smartest man alive. And it's like, no, I was just using Census and Shodan and MaxMind and just kind of a solid methodology, right? But that's an example of people are like, okay, yeah, Shodan, roger that. I understand that. Okay, Census, that's another one. Cool. But how can we actually apply this? Right? How can we actually use this to help us out to solve the mysteries? Forensics and OSINT are so similar. People have no idea. You're solving mysteries. You're trying to figure out what happened. It's just a matter of, are you getting the information from like a phone or a device, an image that you have, or are you getting the information from the internet? But it's just so similar in the methodologies in so many ways.
So we're going to throw up our last poll, because you kind of touched on something there that, mentioning Germany and internationals, that obviously with OSINT, there's a lot of debate considering privacy and public information online, and to be able to remove yourself from, well-known sources online. So I'm kind of curious from the community's perspective here. OSINT privacy often conflict. Write out a few words that concern you about the capabilities of OSINT. There's a little bit, harder one, but again, tying it back to you, where do you, think that, these countries and, regions of the world, the EU, and with their compliance mechanisms, is the ship sailed? Is legal going to be able to keep up with trying to maintain privacy, or is it, what do you think at this point, if you're advising any of these lawmakers about what this means, if you're testifying in court, Congress or anything like that, what would you say? Is it like it's done, you can't do anything about it, or is, hey, here's some recommendations? Where do you stand?
There are recommendations that you can make, and that's always a question that you get, especially towards the end of the class, of people realizing how much is out there and like what can you do to kind of redact it, and there are some strategies. But also at some point, it's my personal belief is you got to live your life, right? I personally, like, I don't worry about it too much. I try not to do dumb stuff, but some people kind of take it to the extreme, right? To really protect everything. And you end up setting up trusts, and technically you don't own your house. It's owned by a trust that's, owned by a panda bear in the Cincinnati Zoo. And so you can kind of take that, but on a large scale, right? Yeah, it doesn't really make things go away. It just changes things, right? Like we look at GDPR, some of those European data privacy laws, and now everywhere across the world is kind of using that as the base more and more. And you see some places, even like, California, taking it a little bit further with their privacy laws. And it may change things, but it doesn't really get rid of things, right? If you look at Whois data used to be amazing. You were just talking about Whois, and now Whois is basically a dumpster fire, right? You try to do Whois on something and it's just going to be private. Well, does that mean that it's gone? GDPR and some of these other things killed it? No, it just means we're not using Whois as much anymore. We're using historic Whois data, right? And that kind of becomes valuable. So it's not so much that it kind of fixes things or makes things go away. Some of these privacy laws, it just changes how we have to do things, right? And you adjust. And OSINT is constant adjustment, right? Look at Twitter right now and everything. I was talking about 2 weeks ago to a buddy of mine who's the head of development for a big cyber threat intelligence and kind of a OSINT dark web monitoring firm. And he said that they came to the decision that they just basically 10-3'd Twitter for right now. They're not worrying about it because he got tired of having his developers spend 3 days doing something and then undoing it 2 days later, right? Or having to redo it a week after that. And so, yeah, this OSINT itself is just constant adjustment. And so as these things pop up, you just be like, when Facebook, when they took the graph search and a lot of that away, right? You just don't kind of pack up and say, okay, well, I guess we're not looking at Facebook anymore. You adjust. Me personally, I'll pour myself a drink and then I'll start playing around with things and figuring out, okay, what do we still have, right? Where do we go from here to make this work? So, and that just comes from, I think, when I first started doing this style of work, I was told like we have no budget for equipment, no budget for training, no budget. And it sounds like a joke, and it kind of is, and it kind of isn't. But one nice thing about having no budget is it makes your decisions very, very easy. Right. If there's a capability that you want and you don't have it, you can't afford it, and it's not free, you either build it yourself or you do without it. And coming from that mindset of just having like, okay, solve these problems myself, as really at the time it was very frustrating, but it set me up very well to understand how things work and what's important. And just realizing that, we can adjust, we can figure this out.
So we're going to close up this segment real quick, but like tying into your last statements about the privacy stuff, there's a couple Instagram and TikTok profiles that I follow, and they get these challenges where people say, "Where am I?" Because most of the geotagging and GPS coordinates are removed from pictures these days, but they do really good jobs. Like, "Hey, where am I?" And they just quickly scan their phones, like a 10-second thing, and then they are able to take landmarks like a water tower, a Wendy's, a CVS, her dialect, and said, "I think that's in the South." They write a program to say, "Where's a Wendy's, a water tower, in this, all within 500 meters," and then the sun, the direction, and there's a road, and then they're able to find it within 10 minutes. So here's exactly where you're standing. That kind of stuff. I'm sitting there like, wow, it just, the amount of capabilities out there, what you're able to just pull from a video or a picture is hands down amazing. And so it's a fantastic skill set to have, and you never get wrong with it.
Some of the things that I see on social media, like Twitter with the Russia, Ukraine, and other parts of the world, you're seeing analysis of imagery that less than a decade ago you would never see outside of a classified briefing.
Yeah.
You're seeing like things, like I said, even like literally less than a decade ago, you would never see that quality of work in a classified briefing. And now it's just someone on Twitter just analyzing the imagery and what's going on. This is like, it's mind-boggling. It is. Yeah.
When you're, especially fake news, if there's a picture and they said, "This is going on in Ukraine right now," I was like, no, that's Kazakhstan. I heard that's a picture of not even anywhere near Ukraine. All right. So closing now, if you're just getting started in OSINT, what do you do? Are there books? A couple of people asked a question in there about, is there anything have you wrten a book? Like what is your advice? What is your one takeaway you want everyone to walk away?
I wrote 6 of them. They come with the SANS class. I know Ray Baker just wrote a book that I have a copy of. I haven't had a chance to actually read it yet, but I'm sure that's fantastic. Michael Bazell always comes out with the OSINT books and does a good job. I think the biggest one is really to just get involved with the community. Years ago, you realize, especially with me trying to pay attention to forensics, with pen testing offensive stuff, with OSINT, there's too much. There's constantly going on. You can't keep track of everything. And so in a lot of ways, I really kind of outsourced that to Twitter. There's certain people that I follow on Twitter, and I just assume that if something is important in that space, I'm going to hear about it, right? And we have that with OSINT too, right? If you're following one of my fellow SANS instructors and good friend Nico Deckens, Dutch OSINT guy, if something is important in that space, he's going to tweet out about it. There's someone named Sector 35 that does an amazing job coming out with This Week in OSINT, where they basically go through and gather blog posts or different videos or kind of that were new that week that they thought were really useful for OSINT, and puts that out there. And so just following a few key people and paying attention to those resources just to keep an eye on what's new, and just once again think about how you can incorporate these things into your daily life, right? There's so many times I hear people say like, "Oh, I don't really have experience." But like I said, there's ways that you can incorporate this into your daily life. Right.
Okay, so favor, and in the producers in the back, if you could put up Matt's Twitter handle real quick while we're chatting about this. Matt, you mentioned a lot of people to follow on Twitter. Can you put out a tweet immediately following this and saying, "Here's the people, here's this community you should follow, your must follow list for OSINT," and that way, for everyone who's listening right now or coming in later, they'll be able to find this tweet, maybe make it a pinned tweet or something like that for a little bit of time. That way there's this resource that people could go to, and maybe post on Twitter and LinkedIn.
Absolutely.
That would be there. That would be, I don't know if you started an OSINT Discord or a LinkedIn community, but maybe that would be helpful too, as this is definitely growing at this point.
Yep. No, it's definitely working on it, trying to build up that community. Like I said, working with Nico, and we'll get there. We're getting it going, but it's just exciting right now, right? There's all this change, but that's part of the, I think that's part of the appeal for a lot of us, right? Why we like it is you never know everything. Things are always new. Things are always changing, and it kind of forces you to be on top of your game.
All right, my friend. I can't wait to see you again. Get another big bear hug from you.
Coming up soon.
people stand in line for. Thank you again for everything you're doing in the community, your expertise, what you've done for the government in the past, everything you've done up until this point, in being on our show today. Thanks again. For everyone else, this is this week's Wait, Just, and Infosec.
Thank you for listening to the Wait, Just, and Infosec podcast. Remember to join us live every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern for a new episode of Wait, Just, and Infosec. You can watch at sans.org/WJAI or go to the SANS LinkedIn or YouTube channels. The Wait, Just, and Infosec podcast will be released every Wednesday at noon. Thanks for listening. See you next week.